In this tutorial, we will focus on drawing tree trunks. So essentially what we will do is we will draw tree trunks at different distances from the viewer, growing smaller with the distance, and we will see how we can have a very nice landscape just by using tree trunks. So always start your landscape by putting down your horizon line. So this is the line, far out in the distance towards which the things recede and where the sky meets the ground. And it's always good to lay it down light because you'll have other elements that will go over it. So I put down my horizon line over here. Now, the first thing to always understand is that the size of the different things towards horizon will determine how far that horizon is. So, for example, if I put a tree trunk that is very small over here, then it will indicate that the horizon this is far out because the trees have become really small. On the other hand, if I have a tree trunk that is a bit bigger in size, so actually let's do that. So I'll put down my tree trunk something like this. So it's not too small. So this will bring the horizon a bit closer. So that's how it works, when the size of the tree trunks or stones or what have you, the relative size with respect to this line determines how far out that line is. So what I've done for this tutorial is to put down this tree trunk over here that is not too small. So this brings the horizon a bit closer, or this ground a bit closer to the viewer. And the other thing to always do is to have a nice balanced distribution of things in your composition, in your drawing. And with tree trunks, what this means is that, have a bit that is closer to the viewer. So I'll start by laying down this tree trunk that is a bit closer. And by closer, I mean what is happening is that it is getting closer, so it's getting away from the horizon. So as the tree trunks, they get away from the horizon, they get towards the viewer, and their size increases. So again, the closer that a tree trunk is. So here, let's lay down a tree trunk that is closest to the viewer for our drawing. So here, this is closest to the viewer and farthest from the horizon, and I will also make it the biggest. So again, as the tree trunk got closer to the viewer, it got bigger in size as well. So this is the closest to the viewer, and this one I have somewhere in the middle ground. Let's lay out one more tree trunk somewhere over here as well. So I'm doing a nice distribution of tree trunks in my composition, and then I can add one more over here as well. And as you can see, I'm doing my composition, in pen using dotted lines. So you can either do that, or you can even start with a pencil. So it depends on your preference. But always, use a dotted line so that if you don't like something, then you can easily kind of, draw over it. And let's put down one more tree trunk even further out. So now you can see, what happened when I added this tree trunk a bit further out is that, it gave a indication of even smaller tree trunk, and that, it made the horizon a bit further out as such, right? So if I put down one more tree trunk that is even smaller over here, then it will give the indication of that horizon even further out, very far out, so that the trunks have become very small. So instead of that, let me actually put one more trunk over here that is not too far out, because sometimes, when they are too far out, then it gives a different feel. So what I'm doing in this drawing is to draw trunks at different distances, and they recede towards the horizon. So that gives a nice feel in your drawing. And the other thing is you can always do is to add a path that leads to the horizon. So that adds a nice element of interest, and the viewer's eyes can travel. So again, I will have this path travel like this, and the path follows the same principle of receding with the distance. So the path is essentially almost vanishing with the horizon over here, and what I will do is I will start and widen the path as it gets closer to the viewer. So there I have it. So I use the dotted line, and as you can see, this path is further going out and receding. So always remember this in mind, is that everything as they go towards the horizon, as they recede away from the viewer, they get smaller in size. It applies for tree trunks, it applies for path, it applies for any other element that you might have. And the other thing to also keep in mind is that the different elements in your drawing should be in proportion. So what by that I mean, we have a tree trunk that is this size, so any kind of background distant foliage that we will have should be in relation to that. So I cannot have distant foliage that is too big, because then it will confuse the viewer as to is it far or not. If the horizon is far, which is indicated by the size of the trunk, then the distant foliage should always also be correspondingly smaller. So we will do that in this tutorial. So always keep that in mind, recede your things with the distance, and also keep the different proportion of different elements in relation to each other. So now we have laid down our tree trunks. This is a nice simple drawing where we will have these different tree trunks at different distances. So we will learn how to shade the bark texture for trunks at different distances from the viewer, and then we will also lay a nice distant foliage. So the distant foliage always serves to add interest to that drawing. So if we leave that out, then the eyes, they will travel, and then at far out, the eyes don't have anything to rest on. So it's always good to add a distant foliage to add interest and have something where the eyes rest, and the viewers can take the whole drawing. So we will do that as we go along. So let's start by texturing the trunks. So essentially there are two different techniques for texturing the trunk that are in the middle distance and far out compared to the trunk that are up close. And that's because we want to show more detail for the trunk that are up close. Essentially when you look at anything, you can see more detail in that object if it is closer to you. And the same applies for the trunk. So this trunk, so let me darken it because we are happy with this layout. So any trunk that is closer to the viewer, they will be able to see more of the bark texture for that trunk compared to this trunk, for example, that is further out. So we need to use different techniques to show more bark detail compared to an overall feel for bark that we will give out for these trunks that are a bit further out. So for the trunk that are in middle to the back distance, we give a feel for texture, whereas for the trunks that are up close, we actually try to show a bit more bark detail so the viewer feels that trunk closer to them. The easiest way to add texture to these trunks that are further out is to use these slightly angled lines. So essentially use these angular lines that intersect each other like this. And what happens is that when you use these lines and they intersect each other, they are leaving slightly white in between them. And that gives a feel for a texture. So if you use parallel lines, that doesn't give that much effect, but these angular lines, as you see, they're leaving a bit of white in the center, and when you add them together, when you keep adding more, this starts to give a feel for bark texture. So that's what I will do for this trunk. So let's start over here, and I lay down a layer of these angular intersecting lines over here. So again, use the same stroke, lay down the lines. The other very important thing to understand is that to bring out the roundness of a trunk, we need to have one end darker than the other. So any object that is rounded, will have one end darker than the other. So what I've done over here is to make this end darker. So here I will add few more these angular lines to make one end even darker. So as you see, as I darken one end, and this end I have left a bit lighter. So because of that, now we can feel the roundness of the trunk. So I can even darken almost one end, and that difference in tone, in shading from dark to the light, is giving a feel of roundness for the trunk. So that's very important to keep in mind, is that when you use the stroke to add bark texture, you also make one end darker than the other, as I've done over here, to bring out the roundness of the trunk. The other thing that you can also do is to make the edges a bit jagged. So I drew edges like this, but also make the edges a bit jagged, so it gives a feel for the roughness of the bark texture for the trunk. So that's what I will do for this end. I will add a bit of jaggedness over here, and as you can see, by adding that jaggedness, you actually get more feel for the bark texture compared to a line that is smooth over here. So I did that. And you can also actually add a bit of crevices like this, tapered crevices in the trunk, in the main body, to give a bit more feel for the texture. So I can add that as well. For example, if I want over here, I can add that kind of tapered crevices as well. So this is how you can easily add bark texture to a middle ground to the trunk that are far out. And we will use the same technique for this trunk as well. So I will go ahead and I will use these angular lines over here as well. So by again adding the angular lines, I get a initial feel for the texture. And now to bring out the roundness, I again darken one end by adding more of these lines. As you can see, again, by adding more of these lines, I darken one end, and that brings out the roundness. And then I go ahead and then I again roughen the edges a bit by adding this kind of jagged darkness. So this again gives a feel for. So again, as you can see, there is a bit of white left in between, and that gives a feel for bark texture in these trunks. So that's how these lines, they help to bring out the bark texture. And by controlling their lightness and darkness from one end to the other, we can also give a feel for the roundness of the trunk as well. So I do the same for this trunk as well. And then I finally make the edges a bit jagged on both the sides. So there we have it. So we quickly put down the bark texture, or we actually put down a feel for the bark texture, right? So we are essentially not showing the detail for the bark, which is what we will do for this trunk, but over for this trunk that are further out, we are giving a overall feel. And the other stroke that you can actually use also is this angular, these wiggly lines, horizontal and vertical. So essentially, again, this is a wiggly line, and what you can do is to add these lines to give a feel for bark. So that's what we will do for this trunk over here. I'm just using the slightly wiggly lines over here, and again I'm darkening one end over the other, so that those wiggly lines also give a feel for the bark texture as well. So I did that for this trunk as well. And finally, for the trunks that are much further out, a simple technique is to simply darken one end. We don't really have that much space over here to create that shade from the dark to the middle to the light tone. So what you do for the trunk that are further out and are much smaller in size, to simply darken their one end, and also darken this end in a jagged manner. So here, as you can see, I have used a jagged stroke to create the darkness, and don't create a uniform. So if you have a trunk like this, don't just do like this, because that doesn't really give a feel for bark, but make it a bit jagged like this, so it is not straight like this. So that will give a feel for roughness of the bark in that kind of shading as well. So that's what I will do for this trunk. So right now I will just add a bit of jagged darkness over here for this far out trunk. So there, as you can see, just by adding the darkness, which gives an indication of shaded side, you actually give a roundness to the trunk. And by adding it a bit jagged manner, you also give a feel for the, the roughness of the bark texture of the trunk as well. And we will do the same over here as well. So again, I add a bit of jagged darkness and leave this white. It's very important to keep one end lighter. So essentially we have dark one end, jagged edge, and white, and that gives a feel for the roundness, and also the jagged texture gives a feel for the roughness of the bark as well. So do that for the trunk that are further out and are much smaller in size. So so that's what we have done for these two trunks that are furthest out. So now we have essentially done our trunks that are in middle to far out distance, and now we will draw the detailed bark texture for the trunk that is closest to the viewer. So here, if you really want, you can use the same angular lines to draw the bark, but essentially it won't really show the bark detail, and it's always good to show the detail where possible, because that adds more interest to your drawing. And to do that, what we do is to first draw a bark outline. So essentially, by more bark details, we mean being able to show the individual bark pieces as well. So essentially, there are many different types of bark, but the simplest way to show bark detail is to draw this kind of outline of bark pieces in a trunk. And then what we will do is we will then shade these bark pieces individually, and that will give a feeling of more bark details, because the viewer can essentially now see the individual bark pieces as well. So essentially, whenever you want to show more detail, you have to essentially, show the outline of that detail and then shade it appropriately, so that outline brings out the desired effect for the viewer. So what we are doing over here is that instead of creating a uniform shade that we did for far out trees, and where we just gave an overall feel for the bark, what we are doing is we are actually providing more detail by drawing this outline. So the first step is to draw this outline shape of the bark pieces, and here you can use different approaches as well. So what I'm doing is I'm simply using this shape, so I draw it like this, and then I draw here and draw here. So it's slightly rounded. Do not use this round, so do not do a simple round like this, but create a wave pattern like this, create a wave, something like this, and then overlap with each other. So by doing this, you create a feel of layered barks. So that's what I'm doing over here. So essentially, for the closest tree to the viewer, I'm showing more bark detail by first creating the bark pieces. And the other thing to notice is that the size of these bark pieces is biggest in the center, and it gets smaller as it goes toward the edges. So because of perspective, the pieces at the edges are seen smaller compared to the ones that are in the center. So that's what I've done here as well. So the pieces at the edges are smaller and they're biggest in the center. So there we have it. As you can, you can even before shading the bark pieces, you can see that drawing such a bark outline gives an indication of more bark details visible to us. So once we have done that, the second step is to then shade or create the texture for these pieces individually. And the easiest way to do it is to simply use these parallel lines like this. And the other thing to again keep in mind or notice is that I am leaving a white at the edge of each individual bark piece. So, and this is similar to how we achieve the roundness in our trunk overall over here. Use the parallel lines, but don't darken it all. Darken one end and leave the other white. And when you do this, this will also gives a feel of curvature of the bark and make it, give it more interest and make it feel more realistic. So that's what we will do. So again, you do it each individually, but you don't extend it all the way, and you leave a layer of white on the other end that gives a feel of roundness. So that's what we will do. So here I will start by doing this parallel lines over here as well. So as you can see, I'm leaving a bit of white at the edges of each bark piece, and that will give a feel of roundness in the end, because if you darken it uniformly, then it just feels like a flat dark spot and doesn't give a feel of the roundness. And again, you can use different strokes to texture that bark pieces. I've used the parallel lines, but if you want, you can also use these marks like this, for example. Using these marks also kind of give a feel for the bark texture as well. So, you can use different shapes for this bark outline, and you can use different marks to create a feel for bark. But in the end, you always have to leave a bit of white at the edges, because that is what will give a feel for the roundness of the bark. So if you're using, a simple marks like this, you can do like this over here as well. And again, leave a white over here at the edge, so that the white that is left will give a feel for the roundness. So that's what I'm doing over here, is I'm simply using parallel lines to create a simple shading for the bark texture. And just because of the use of the bark outline, it will give a feel of more bark details visible to the viewer. And again, do this for the trunks that are up close, so don't do it the other way around, so don't show bark detail for this trunk, for example, and then use this kind of stroke for the tree that are up close, because the core notion of perspective is that more details are visible as objects get closer to the viewer, and that is the impression that we want to give. So for any objects, any tree trunk, for example, or the shrubbery, or anything that is closer to the viewer, we'll try to give more detail and take that detail away with the distance. So that conveys, the distance to the viewer in our drawing as well. So as you can see, the white that I have left is giving a feel of texture, roundness to our drawing. If I did not leave that white, then right now we would just have a big black spot, and that would not be interesting, right? So by leaving this white in our bark pieces, we get a feel for the texture of the bark, the roundness, the curvature. So see, so there we have it. Essentially it's a very simple way to draw a bark with a feel of close-up detail. So there we have it. So quite simply, again, draw the bark outline, make the pieces in the center bigger, and then shade them so that one end is darker and the other end is lighter. And again, this white serves to differentiate different bark pieces. As here you can see that this is two different pieces because there's a white, so this layer of white in between, it helps us to give a curvature, and also it helps us to differentiate between the different bark pieces. So we get a nice overall effect in the end. So now we have done our texturing of the bark for the far out trees as well as to the close-up tree. The next thing that we can do is to essentially ground these tree trunks. So here we have a feel for the end of the trunk, but its connection to the ground is not done, so it doesn't look as good. And the simplest way to ground a tree trunk is to use the grass stroke like this. So this is the grass stroke that you can use. And the simplest way to ground a tree trunk is to essentially show a thick patch of grass at the bottom. So let's do that. So what I will do is I will go ahead and create this kind of grassy patch. So again, I'm using this grass stroke, and I'm using a dense grass, indication of dense grass at the bottom of the trunk to essentially ground the trunk. And what I'm also doing is to use a shape like this, slightly angular shapes like this. So I'm not just doing a flat, but I'm using a bit more interesting shapes to ground the trunk by adding grass. So there we have it. As you can see, just by darkening the base of the trunk with a simple grass stroke like this, it makes it much more nicer looking. So now we actually have a feel for a trunk that is properly grounded. So that makes it much more interesting and gives a nice overall feel. So we will do the same for all the trunks, and we'll use the same stroke, this thick small grassy stroke that gives a feel for some kind of ground cover, ground foliage to ground the trunk. So I will do the same for this trunk, and there we have it. We grounded that trunk as well, and we do the same for these other trunks as well. So this is a very simple, effective way of grounding the trunk, and the grounding a trunk is always very important because it adds a nice feel to the overall drawing. So I do the same, and again here I just use a very simple grass stroke and just darken the base a little bit over there, and like this is done as well here, and I will finally darken this trunk. It's very simple grass stroke, like this, and just they're slightly angular, so don't make it vertical like this, just make it a bit angular like this. So by using this slightly angular vertical, short vertical lines, gives a feel for grass and helps to ground our trunks. So there, we grounded the trunks as well, and let me also darken the path a little. So this is the path that is leading into the distance that the eyes of the viewer can travel. So there we have it. So let's now create some nice background foliage that the eyes can rest on. Essentially, as the viewer takes in the scene, they go with the tree trunks and they move out in the horizon. And what we will do for the distant foliage is to essentially use this stroke to create a sense of something in the distance. So what I'm doing is using this stroke. So this is a very effective stroke for giving a feel of foliage in the distance. So it's a round like this, but we are not using a rounded shape, but we are using this slight loops like this, it's this stroke. So this, a bit of loopiness in your line it gives a feel for foliage like this. So that's what we will do. So we will essentially have an indication of such distant foliage by using these strokes. So it's again, a simple stroke to practice like this. So using the same loop, but you are, not making very straight, but like this. And then you're not closing it. You never close it, but you make one layer and then you draw other layers on top of it. So that's what I'm doing over here. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the layers on the top, they become smaller. So as you draw more layers, they become smaller because their size is perceived smaller by our eyes. So something like this, for example, here, and like this. So this kind of loops, give a feel of a distant foliage. So that's what I will do over here. And I will draw them like this and maybe create some layers as well. So the one on the tops are a bit smaller than the one on the ground, which are the biggest. So there we have it. And if you want, you can actually leave these loops as is, and that gives a feel for foliage as well. But what we will do is to shade each of this foliage by darkening the bottom. So here what we do is we essentially use these angular lines and we darken the bottom of each piece individually. This is very similar to how we did the bark. Essentially in the bark we use these angular lines to darken the one end and leave the other end lighter, and we will do the same for these foliage, but we will darken the bottom and leave a layer of white at the top. So again, we are doing this to give a feel of volume for the far out foliage, and in a ground foliage your bottom is always darker than the top. So that's what I'm doing. I'm simply adding a bit of darkness to the bottom. And sometimes if it becomes too small, then just use a dot or something like this just to add bottom darkness to the bottom. So here I just indicate slight darkness to the bottom here, for example. So just by adding a bit of darkness and leaving the top white, you start to get a feel of volume for the foliage. So this looks a bit bland. It looks a bit that you feel that there's some foliage, but it doesn't really give an indication of volume. And by adding the darkness at the bottom and leaving a layer of white, you start to get a feel of volume for the foliage. And it always is more effective. It always looks nicer. So just do that. Add a bit of darkness. Don't darken it completely. And that will bring out the roundness of your foliage. And again, that white serves to differentiate the different layers of foliage. The thing with the pen and ink, especially black and white pen and ink drawing, is that we don't have elements and we don't have color to separate different elements. So leaving a layer of white, it serves two purposes. It gives it roundness, and at the same time it also helps to differentiate between the different layers or different elements we have in our drawing. So here, for example, again, I darken the bottom and leave a slight white at the top. And again, don't leave it a line, in a sense. And when you're leaving the white, just make it a little bit random, So over here, I have this darkness that is in a bit jagged. So that actually is preferable than doing a very uniform darkening. So just add a bit of darkness like this, and there you have it, So this kind of jagged darkness at the bottom brings out the roundness or the curvature, or gives more interest to your drawing, because then it's adding a perception of depth, so you're now getting depth in your drawing, and you feel that the foliage has a bottom and top. And so see, just by adding that a bit of white, by adding a bit of black to the bottom of those outline of the distant foliage that we drew, gives a nice feeling of depth to that foliage. So now we added one layer of foliage, distant foliage, and you can add, another layer, make it more interesting by, using something called these lines. These angular parallel lines, they also give a nice feel of distant foliage, and essentially it tells the viewer that there is something further out there, but it doesn't, there is no more texture in it. But so it's very effective for distant foliage. So you can always have different layers of distant foliage. So we drew one layer, and you can end at that. But if you want to add a bit more interest, we can add these angular parallel lines over here as well. So this is saying that there's something further out behind these bushes as well. So I will add them as well. So by adding these parallel lines, and what I like to do actually is to have my trunks extend above the distant foliage. So I will just extend these trunks a bit over here so that they actually are going above this distant foliage. And same for this trunk over here, just to extend the trunk. And the same for this. So now we have our trunk, they're extending above the distant foliage, and the same for this. And also to keep in mind is that the height should also be in proportion to the distance. So for example, this is the farthest out trunk, so I will make the height of this a bit bigger than that. This can be also extended a bit, so their heights are in proportion. So this is a vignette in which we are not completing the tree foliage, but we still want to keep the height of these trees in proportion, so this tree actually should be then extending out farthest to the top. So this closest tree is the biggest, so it goes to the topmost, and then we have the other trees that height corresponding to the distance, and we can then again same add a bit of add the bark outline over here for this trunk like we did before, and then shape these bark pieces just like that. Just by adding a bit of black to the one end of the bark outline, individual bark pieces, we again bring out their roundness. So again, I added these bark pieces, and now we have the trees at the right height for our background foliage. And I will then continue with by adding these parallel lines over here, and there we have our second layer of background foliage. And what I can also do is to vary their height a little bit. So again, I'm the distant foliage, try to make a bit more organic shape like this, so don't make it a flat distant foliage. So again, what I'm doing is to just vary the height a little bit so that we have that kind of variation in the outline, top outline of the distant foliage. So now we have one more layer of distant foliage behind the front layer, which we did using this style, these loops to suggest there is some foliage there. The other thing you can also do is to make the base of this darker as well. Again, what happens is that in any tree line, in any kind of distant foliage, the the top is the lightest because it receives the most sun. So by adding the bit of darkness to the bottom of this, we again give it a feel of volume. So what I'm doing is I'm just adding a bit of darkness to the bottom of this second layer as well. So that will bring out a bit of nice volume as well. So there we have it. And I'll do the same. So as you can see, just as I'm darkening this, you're getting a nice sense of a bit of feel for the foliage, because now you can see that the top is lighter, so it receives, because it receives more sunlight, and this base, not the base, but this area behind the bush is darker because it will receive less sunlight. So that again, all these small things, they add the perception of depth to the drawing. And it's always good to add as much depth as you can, because in a landscape, those small things really makes a big difference in how the viewer perceives the final drawing. So now we are done with our background foliage. The next thing that we have to do essentially is to draw the ground. And essentially we have grounded the trunks, but we still don't really have a good definition of the ground, right? So by adding a good ground definition and some kind of ground cover, it helps to make the drawing feel complete. The easiest way to add the ground cover or the ground definition is to use these horizontal parallel lines. And these horizontal lines, they increase in size towards the viewer. So by using these horizontal lines, we define the ground form. So essentially we are saying that the ground is a bit flat over here because our lines are flat. So for example, if you have, this kind of drawing, then you can, use this kind of rounded lines to define a bit of rounded ground. So over here, we'll use these horizontal lines. And I'm also increasing the size of the lines because they serve to reinforce the perspective, distance. So essentially when the viewer looks at these lines, they see the ground as flat, but because the lines are also increasing with distance, they get the feel of distance as well. So this is a very simple technique to use to add the perception of depth in your drawings. So always add perception of depth, because that always makes the drawing more interesting. So by increasing these lines towards the viewer over here, we are doing just that. So as you can see, by using these horizontal parallel lines that increase towards the viewer, you define the ground form and add more perception of depth as well. So now we can see that our ground is kind of flat over here. And what we need to do next is to cover the ground with something. The ground is defined, and the simplest thing to cover it with is grass. And again, we saw the grass stroke before. And what we will do is to use these kind of slightly angular lines to draw the grass on our ground. And again, we will vary the size of grass with distance. So essentially the grass that is far out will be perceived as much smaller than the grass that is up close to the viewer. And that will again add perception of depth. So for the grass that is further out, use these very small angular lines, like the kind that we use to ground the tree trunks. So that's what we will use for the grass that is much further out, these small angular lines like this. So here you can see these are small angular lines like this, and that's what I'm using for the grass further out. But as I get closer to the viewer, what I'm doing over here is to increase the size of the grass a bit. So here my grass is a bit bigger. They are not very small fine lines that are used for the further out over here. So here I've used a bigger grass stroke, and that again serves to reinforce the whole notion of distance to the viewer. So as their eyes travel the distance, they see that the trunks are reducing in size, they see that the grass is reducing in size, and even these horizontal lines are reducing in size. So this all together makes the drawing rich in depth, and that always makes it more interesting. So here, as you can see, the grass stroke that I used closest to the viewer is bigger, and it's reducing in size as I'm going towards the distance over here. And the grass at the very far out near the distant foliage is almost, a small stroke that I used over here to ground the trunks. So I'll do the same over here, use a very small grass stroke for the distant grass, and then increase the size a bit as I get towards the viewer. So here again there's a difference, gradual increase in the size of the grass towards the viewer. There we have it. And the other very important point is that we are not covering the whole ground with the grass. What we are doing is to just give a suggestion, and what this suggestion is doing is to is to give viewer a feel for the ground covered with grass, and that's enough. You literally don't have to cover the whole ground with a single with grass stroke, because that will actually make the whole drawing much more darker. If you were to add this kind of grass stroke to all each and every point in your ground, this will actually become a lot darker, and it will actually distract from the whole composition. So what we have done is to add a hint of grass, and that suggestion is giving a nice overall feel for the ground as grass cover, and that's kind of what we want. So always use that, that notion of suggestion is you do not want to draw more strokes than you need to convey the feel that you want in your drawing. So sometimes if you do want to convey a ground deeply covered in grass, then maybe you can use more of grass stroke. But usually for your landscape, where the grass or the ground cover is something that supports the overall composition, then this kind of grass is enough. It's giving a nice feel for our ground as grass covered, and it's not making it too dark. So again, just use a very small grass and add a bit here, add a bit there, give a feel for the grass, and that's enough. And that's what I will do for over here as well. So I will add some grass over here, and I will again increase the distance with as I get closer to the viewer. And again, this the thing to notice is that these grass strokes are not parallel, so it's not like I'm doing these parallel lines. What I'm trying to do is to create a lump of grass. So I start with one point like this, so that's one lump. Then I move on, and then I create a second lump. So this is a lump. This is the kind of stroke that you should aim for, and then move your hand around so that you get an even distribution of these lumps. And when you do that, then the ground seems grass covered. So I drew one lump here, then I move my hand, do second lump over there, one over here, one over here, and then I go back and then add one over there as well. So this is kind of a random distribution of these lumps of grass, which gives the feel of the ground as grass covered. So that's what I will do over here as well. Add some more grass, add some more grass, and see, my hand is constantly moving. That's the fun. So you're enjoying the process, doing a random movement of your hand and adding these grass clumps to different places. And again, I'm not overdoing it, so one clump here, here is enough. In the end, this whole ground is now it has a feel of the ground as grass cover, right? So that's enough over there, and then I will add some more over here. So experiment with adding different levels of grass to your composition, and based on your liking, you can add more grass or less grass. But usually for my drawing, this level of grass is enough for me, because that's giving a nice feel. It is not darkening the ground too much, and so other elements, they also stand out in our drawing. And I will add a bit more grass over here as well in this distance. So now that we are almost done, now we need to just define the ground. The ground is just all white at the moment and it's not looking that good. So what you can do is to use these horizontal lines at one end. And what this does is actually gives something for the eyes to travel towards the distance. So I'm again, using the perspective, and these lines are reducing in size. So just by adding this bit line, they give a more definition to the path. And actually, let's extend it so that the path will continue right here, and then I add more to this. So just by darkening one end of the path, it gives a feel for the more definition of the path, and then the eyes can travel. Don't darken it completely, because leaving one end dark and one white is essentially gives an attention to the path, and it is something that the viewer's eyes can travel. And finally, what we can do is we can also add some small wildflowers to make it more interesting. And the simplest way to add a wildflower is to draw a small stem and then a round and dot in the top. So something like this, dot, and like this, and then ground the stem using a wiggly line. So again, draw a stem, slightly rounded, draw a dot, that completes the flower, and then draw a wiggly line at the bottom to create a small stem of flower. So we can do that, on our path as well. And like I said before, keep things in their sizes in relation to each other. So any kind of flower that I add, you cannot draw a big flower, because that will then look odd compared to the size of the tree trunk we have, right? So all the different elements, they should be in proportion to each other with respect to the size that we have for them. So what I'm doing is adding some grass over there, and again, the size of the stem will also reduce with distance. So here, as you go further out, you can add a bit of flowers, wildflowers, and again, by adding few here and there, again, gives a nice feel for the whole path, as a bit covered with those wildflowers. So that's a very strong thing about pen and ink drawing, is that we are using this concept of suggestion, just to draw a bit here, a bit there, and that starts to give the path a bit covered with wildflowers. And what you can do is to give the path a bit more definition. You can add a bit more grass at one end, for example. So you can always change the density of the grass, and if you want to highlight some areas of your drawing, then you can do so by adding a bit more density of things over there. So here I will just add some more small grass towards the edge of the path, so that the path has a bit more nicer definition. So I'm just adding a bit more grass, and then I can add some more wildflowers as well. So here now our path has a nice end definition as well. So there we have it. We quickly put together a nice simple landscape, or just using the tree trunks. So the thing to always understand is that, and let me just actually darken the base of this distant horizon so that it stands out. So just by using the tree trunks, going out into the distance, and using the distant foliage, we put together a nice, pleasant landscape, and we use the perspective to really add interest to our drawing. So essentially, we have a path that is going out into the distance, the tree trunks that are reducing with the distance, and a distant foliage where the eyes can rest. So just by using these simple elements, we put together a nice simple landscape that you can enjoy doing. Thanks. Bye bye.